Good afternoon, good morning, evening, everybody. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the issues in South Africa with a focus on Pretoria and Johannesburg, which is the main metropolitan sort of area with the highest population and economic concentrations in South Africa. But I think my presentation is a bit different from what Jim just talked about and maybe what we'll hear later on from Guillermo. In that, I think what's been happening in the South African context has really been very sort of short-term crisis management in nature, which I think is fairly typical within the other countries in Africa as well, in terms of how they've responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit about what I think some of the issues and the implications are that we are facing in the longer run. So I think this time is characterized by two crises that are happening at the same time. The health crisis, of course, firstly, but then also the economic crisis that follows on from that. And I'll talk a little bit about the background to the state of the pandemic in Africa and South Africa, just to set the context. But there's also two responses, I think, on two levels: the tactical response, kind of short-term management kind of issues, and then also longer-term strategic issues, which raise questions about how the pandemic is changing cities and shaping mobility and so on, which is part of today's webinar as well. So Africa generally has seen slower growth in the number of infections for reasons maybe including lower urbanization levels, younger population, probably also lower testing. So I think the data is not as complete as some other parts of the world. The World Health Organization is warning that Africa is at the start of an exponential phase of transmission. And we can see that it's on the map there. It's quite unevenly spread around the continent, with countries such as Nigeria, Cameroon, Algeria, and so on, having more infections. And then South Africa has almost half of the continent's cases at this point. So we are clearly facing sort of a pretty serious situation here. The graph on the right shows just the growth in infections. Over the past 2 weeks, the number of infections in South Africa has doubled. So we're now at around 106,000 with about 2,000 deaths. And this is to be expected because South Africa managed to delay the onset of the full-scale pandemic by going into very hard lockdown very early on, before we even had one death, and that was towards the end of March. But as the economic impacts of this in terms of job losses and economic hardship became very severe, we are now have been gradually loosening these restrictions just as the transmissions are rising. So it's quite a precarious position. And this is very relevant for public transport and for transport in general, as you will see just now. So in terms of the tactical short-term responses in the public transport sector, firstly, there's been the lockdown phase, kind of similar to what Jim just described. And of course, that's similar to many other countries. But in our case, the strategy was to almost completely curtail all public transport for the first 3 weeks or so, partly to suppress the demand, but partly also to keep people at home and because there wasn't any demand to transport. So there was no buses allowed at all in the country, no trains were running, but interestingly, the minibus taxi, the informal service, paratransit that it normally transports about 60% or so, about 2/3 of our public transport passengers, were kept running, but only for essential workers. So a very restricted service that they could offer only during peak hours. But it's really interesting that that is the mode that ended up being the mobility provider during that first crisis time, with government sanction. We have now gradually started to reopen all the public transport services, but still with quite restricted capacity. So buses and trains, some trains are running, buses and the minibus taxis typically have to run with load factors of less than about 70%. So I think a little bit higher than in the US. So that means in a minibus of about 16 seats, you can have 10 people transported. There's no long distance travel allowed between cities, and the same kind of hygiene control in terms of mandated mask wearing and sanitizing of vehicles. Those things are mandatory. And then the third leg of the short-term response has been an economic and financial support to these businesses, where government has stepped in and sourced a massive economic relief package for the hard-hit industries, including some for public transport. But this is really meant to just tie them over in the short run. But it turned out to be quite contentious, as you will see just now. Some of the results of what we've seen so far, public transport demand is certainly down. We also have a problem with data, but this data from Google's mobility report, it's not a perfect measure of demand, but it's still interesting. It shows that the public travel to public transport hubs was down by up to 60%, and this was about a week and a half ago. But that's much more curtailed than commuting to workplaces, which suggests two things to me. The first one is that as Google's measure is more heavily skewed towards private transport and towards measuring cars, it's clear that the demand reduction has been much more severe amongst the public transport sector, and that's typically low-income public transport users, as compared to people who still have their work and are traveling to those workplaces. So there's definitely an indication of some distributional effects, some equity effects in terms of who could travel and who not. There's also a possibility that the public transport is losing more of its non-work travel, which would also make sense if people have reduced disposable income and so on. So that's where the public transport demand dips more heavily. So one can see the impact of all of this on public transport industry, especially the informal modes, which receive no direct government subsidy, operating subsidy at least. The industry complains of severe pressure on its profitability, and there's fears that up to 40% of the fleet might be repossessed if the owners can't pay their installments anymore from next month. And there also has been threats of very large fare increases, which would obviously be very bad for passengers in these times, because once again, there's very little ability. Well, there's no mechanism for government to step in at this point and reduce those fares. Then the support package that has been offered by our government is quite substantial, but it has so far been rejected by some parts of the minibus taxi industry, saying it's not enough. And this Monday we saw massive strikes in the Pretoria, Johannesburg region, where commuters were stranded just as they were wanting to return to work. And the picture you can see at the bottom right there are these long queues of people that were trying to get onto the BRT system after not being able to get onto their usual taxis to get to work. So this support package of more than 1 billion rands is still contentious, and it actually reflects a more long-standing, I think, lack of trust between the taxi industry folks and the government. So these are all short-term issues, and the question is also, what about the long term? Now, I think there's actually been in our part of the world very little discussion of the longer term impacts, and very little of the kind of thing that Jim was mentioning, kind of thinking about reimagining streetscapes and taking opportunities to change fuels and so on. I think there's been, my impression is that all of government has really been in sort of crisis management mode, and we've seen very small ability to start grappling with the longer term, wider issues. And I think it's probably the same in most other African countries as well. One can have, of course, sympathy with this because it is a crisis, but it does also reflect, I think, a lack of institutional capacity, institutional depth in much of government over here. What's interesting is that we've also actually seen displayed the importance of the informal or the paratransit sector as part of a resilient city. Because I think from the start of lockdown, these very dispersed small vehicle types of services proved to be very flexible and adaptable and well suited to the reduced volumes, to transporting the reduced volumes that that we were seeing at this time, and also suited to the dispersed nature of our cities. It also displayed, on the other hand, also the limitations of this kind of informal service, which, for instance, the fact that the informal industry demonstrably didn't have the deeper resources that they could draw on to help weather the storm. A counterexample is that once our higher end train system in the Pretoria, Johannesburg area, the Gautrain, was able to start running again, they were actually able to increase their capacity to make sure that there was less crowding than usual. Of course, taking a financial knock, but they did have deeper pockets to dig in to do that. And of course, the minibus taxi industry cannot do that. There's also quite a lot of difficulty in coordinating and integrating across all these different small players, and that's of course an enduring problem with informality that one could see playing out even more during this time. So I think strategically we do have some opportunities for doing things better. I think all of us, a lot of people agree that we do have to move towards better city-wide outcomes and not focus so much on individual operators and individual networks. But just the happenings of the last few weeks have made it clear to me that there's really no common agreement or roadmap between the private sector and the government. And this is definitely needed. Now, our government is seeing this crisis as well as the financial package that they are offering as an opportunity to try to promote formalization and better management in the informal industry, and trying to make, for instance, formal registration of taxi operators as a formal business entity a prerequisite for accessing the funding that government has made available on a one-time basis. But I'm not so sure this is likely to succeed because there's still no kind of larger buy-in from the sector and larger vision and a shared kind of vision between government and the paratransit industry on where this will go in the future. It's also possible that the reduced fleets that we might see on the minibus side might be an opportunity to address some of the oversupply of these vehicles in some areas, and also introducing new types of vehicles that are more suited to different routes, where small vehicles are definitely not the optimal mode. So there's definitely opportunities for changing things because it is a very fluid situation. But of course, I think that needs a wider buy-in. So lastly, I also believe that there are opportunities for technology enhancements in the informal sector especially. We haven't seen much of that in South Africa, but for instance, in Kenya, I saw that there are efforts to use cashless ticketing to to provide to move away from the handling of cash on the informal buses, on the matatus. And that's kind of thing could certainly set the scene for much wider operational changes in terms of payment of drivers and so on, and contracting contracting out of routes and so on. That would be very good in the longer run. So in conclusion, I think for me, these dual crises have highlighted the issues that I've listed here. Firstly, a real issue about institutional depth in our governance institutions. Then just the importance of having adaptable systems in the face of all these fast changes. And I think adaptability also means the ability to survive under depressed demand in places where there is not that much extra support that will come from government, even less than in South Africa. And it's clear to me that we do need to retain the benefits of these distributed small vehicle operations in our context, but also that would only be possible if there is a common vision for a more optimal and multimodal system that works together in the larger scheme of things. Thank you. That's all I have for now.